All right, there we go. Now we're recording. So, welcome to Real Talk, December 2023. Um, as you guys know, we're talking about the war in Israel, doing a part two to our November Real Talk, where we explored and broke down what happened in the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel. And we jumped in to consider the facts, the reasons behind it, who Hamas is, and yet we were left with a lot of questions, like a lot of good questions about the history of Israel and all of that. And so I hope to delve into some of those and provide some support there. But like I said, I want this to be a chance, um, especially for y'all that are here to really dig in and ask the questions that y'all have been wondering about or share stories from and developments that have happened during the last couple of weeks. So I just have a few points I want to walk through, I think, of the most important developments that we've seen, as well as some really important points to reiterate just about the conflict in general. So the best part is that we have now seen a total of 105 civilians released from Hamas's hostage situation. And so that's a huge answer to prayer. Like none of that was on the table when we last met. And so, in a truce that lasted 7 days, this is from the Times of Israel, which was their big national publication, kind of like the New York Times. Um, the truce lasted 7 days, beginning on Friday, November 24th, day after Thanksgiving, with the first release of a group of hostages after some 50 days in Hamas captivity. Unfortunately, the truce broke down early Friday morning, and fighting resumed. And I believe there's a number of reasons for that. I believe Hamas was withholding information, was being evasive. There are allegations um, that Hamas was not being honest about the number of women still in captivity, as they said basically, when we release these hostages, we're going to prioritize releasing women and children. And during the truce, just to give you guys some hard numbers, 105 civilians again were released from Gaza, including 81 Israelis, 23 Thai nationals, one Filipino, and that was in exchange for a total of 210 Palestinian prisoners, all of whom were women and minors. And Israel also allowed humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip during this time, and ceased hostilities. There were no bombings, there was no raids. They were not continuing their assault into Gaza to try to track down terrorists. There was a 7-day pause, and so apparently, the reason the truce ended again, uh, according to the Times of Israel, is that Hamas failed to propose a list of hostages set for release that would be acceptable to Israel in the final hours. And so instead, they sent a message through Qatari and Egyptian mediators. They're like the third party countries that are helping negotiate this deal of a truce. And they said they were prepared to release male hostages. And they said they were going to release the bodies of hostages that were killed while they were in captivity. But Israel responded saying that it knows Hamas is still holding roughly 17 more women and 2 children, including the youngest hostage, a little baby boy who's 10 months old. And it would not hold talks on other categories of hostages, i.e., they didn't want to see men released while women and children were still in captivity. So, um, yeah, it's awful. Apparently, Hamas responded to these claims by saying, in particular, that that baby and his 4-year-old brother and 32-year-old mother, that they were um, yeah, that they were killed. And Hamas claims that they were killed by an Israeli bomb into Gaza. We don't have confirmation of that report. Again, you have to take it with a grain of salt, and I think have extreme caution in believing any reports that come from a terrorist organization like Hamas, because that would be really good propaganda for them to say, oh, you're so worried about this hostage, well, you killed them. But regardless, in terms of the moral responsibility here, Hamas is responsible for the death of any hostage that happens while they're in captivity, because they wouldn't be hostages if Hamas hadn't raided Israel on October 7th. So that's where we are today. And in many ways, there's good news. Like, this is a blessing that we now have seen 105 people who were being held by terrorists return to their families. Some are in hospitals. We're still gathering reports about the treatment of these people during their time in captivity, but there are already reports circling about cruelty, beatings, being forced to watch the live stream of what Hamas did on October 7th. Because remember, Hamas, if you want to know what happened on October 7th, you don't just have to trust, the Israeli media or the Israeli military, the IDF. You can watch the footage, because Hamas fighters wore GoPros and were celebrating their heinous acts of violence and cruelty. And so I want to bring that up. By the way, welcome, Cindy and Oscar. Glad y'all could join us tonight. Happy Monday. So we're just talking about some updates in what has happened since we last talked. And I was discussing a lot of the details of the truce for 7 days that just happened last week, and sharing how 105 people were released, which is a huge answer to prayer. But something that, unfortunately I've seen come up, I even had a Windrose alumni reach out to me really, really callously, and assert that I was hateful and genocidal for, promoting some of these conversations about the war in Israel, which is kind of crazy, because the person didn't even really know where I stand or anything like that in particular. They just made accusations. But I reference that because this person shared with me in private conversation that they didn't even believe that Hamas had perpetrated the attack on October 7th. That they were, indulging honestly in conspiracy theories that Israel had either allowed the attack or even perpetrated the attack themselves on their own people. And that's just absolutely absurd. There's no reason for that. And besides that, you see the pride that these Hamas terrorists took in perpetrating the attack. And again, they live streamed it. They wore GoPros as they were committing these acts of terrorism on October 7th. So back to the facts. I'm just gonna take a look at my notes here. So that's the big news, that Israel has been negotiating and paused its assault for those 7 days until it broke down on Friday. They have resumed their assault into Gaza, including bombings, and they're continuing because Hamas wasn't willing to agree to their terms to release more of the hostages, but also because they are committed to tracking down Hamas terrorists. And remember, people are wondering, how's that going? Well, they have reportedly caught and killed one of the masterminds of the October 7th attack. And if you're wondering, how do they even know who the terrorists are? That is really difficult, as Spencer brought up last time, because these are people who are hiding behind civilians. These are people who don't wear uniforms. These are people who try to blend in, and there are a lot of allies in Gaza who maybe aren't technically members of Hamas, but who are supportive of and protective of Hamas. So it is challenging, but we're talking about people who live streamed their attack. And so there's tons of video footage of these people out there. And so that's really helpful as Israel. I believe um, they've released information that they've identified 700 or 800 different terrorists. Now there were likely more, and so they're working on rooting those out. But yeah, to that end, I think it's important for us to consider, like, a lot of people are like, oh, well, Israel should have really, really pushed to just release more hostages or pursue the truce or like continued negotiating and not broken off the truce on Friday. And that's, it's a fair question to have. Like, why would you not accept male hostages when, at least you could get some and not none? But I think we have to remember a really important point about the danger of negotiating with terrorists, guys. In fact, the United States, long had a policy of saying, like, we don't negotiate with terrorists, especially in hostage situations. Because think about it, guys, if you do that, you are incentivizing terrorists in future operations to take hostages. And so it's really important to see the big picture. And this is a big part of statesmanship. It requires the virtue of prudence to not just look at this narrow situation, but to think, okay, what kind of a precedent does this set if we're willing to adopt the terms of the terrorists, if we're willing to simply do whatever they want us to do? Are we making things worse in the future? And I think that's a really important point for us to consider. Yeah, okay, so I just have two other points I want to bring up before we go into some of y'all's questions. One's fairly short. I also wanted to mention, in addition to the truce, the other big news is that we've had a lot of updates on evidence that terrorists are using hospitals in particular as command stations in the Gaza Strip. And I think this is a really important point because I know from some of the journalists that have been recommended to me, journalists, I put that in quotes, Gazan people who are like social media influencers that are popular, who are showcasing some of the awful things that are happening there. I think that they have a lot to say, and some of these people are, they've become famous overnight trying to share the plight of their people. And a lot of the influencers, several in particular that I looked into, are really calling into question, like, how could Israel assault hospitals? That's a war crime. And yet, now we have evidence. We have hard evidence that the terrorists were using hospitals to as command and control centers. So not just like terrorists hiding out there, but I think it's really important for us to see that these are people who were willing to allow not only civilians to be their shield, but like ill, sick, dying, like people who were in the worst situation, like they were willing to put them as their protectors and human shields in this conflict. And so this is true of a pediatric hospital. And I think this came out like the day after Real Talk last time. I'm going to try to share my screen with y'all so you can see one of the news stories that I pulled up. And this is from Reuters. And so sadly, this first video is of some of the babies who are suffering. I'll address that in a minute. But yeah, so this was November 15th, like a week or two after our last Real Talk, that they found a command and control center in the basement of not only that pediatric hospital, like I mentioned, but in Gaza's biggest hospital. And so it's difficult. You imagine, like, how does Israel do this? Do they say like, oh, well, you're at a hospital, so you get a free pass. We're not going to come get you. Like, you tagged safe. No, like this is absolutely unacceptable, and it shows the complete disregard for the value of human life that Hamas has. Hey, no problem, Maria. I don't think we did record the first session. I think that might have been a mistake. I'll check. But this session will be recorded, so we'll we'll make sure you're in on it. And if you have any particular questions or want to follow up, this goes for anybody, feel free to let me know because I want this to be useful for you guys. Again, this command and control center that was found at the Al-Shifa Hospital, you can go look up a video as well as pictures of materials that it recovered. But they recovered automatic weapons, grenades, ammunition, flak jackets, which there are some allegations floating out there that, like, oh no, they didn't find, a terrorist hideout in a control center in tunnels beneath the hospital. These were just bomb shelters. These were just bomb shelters for innocent people who wanted to go down and be protected. And that was particularly the case. That was particularly the case in the pediatric hospital. I noticed that people were saying like, oh no, like, this wasn't a terrorist hideout where they kept hostages. Just because there were diapers down there and like, a toilet and a chair and other things, it's like, oh, this was just a bomb shelter. But it's like, if this were just a bomb shelter, why did they keep grenades and AK-47s and suicide vests? Like, that's not what you put in a bomb shelter, people. That's a military outpost for the terrorists. And we just have to be really honest about those facts here. And so, let me see if I can click over. Oh, it's not going to go to the story I was hoping. So anyway, this is the Al-Shifa Hospital, and it's so difficult because there are obviously innocent civilians here, but they're not being helped by Hamas, and so there's been a lot of concern about a lack of power at the hospitals and a lack of fuel to run the generators and to keep everything going so that people can be cared for in hospitals. And I think it's important to see that because there is such a breakdown in Gaza, Israel has been withholding fuel to a certain extent, but it's not because they want to punish and harm civilians. They actually have offered to evacuate the Al-Shifa Hospital and numerous other hospitals to help protect those patients. But either the civilians have said no, the civilian leadership, or Hamas has directly prevented the hospitals from being evacuated. So, like, that's crazy, and that's not Israel's responsibility. And plus, their decision to withhold fuel really pertains to the fact that Hamas is apparently stealing tons of fuel, and they have been for many years. Like we talked last time in November about how they've exploited the Gazan people and tons of the aid that they've received. And so Israel is like, well, we're not just going to let free fuel flow into the Gaza Strip, and we can't guarantee that that fuel will go to the hospitals because unfortunately the terrorists controlled the hospitals until very recently, and were using that fuel to wage war against Israel and not to help keep incubators on. And so again, like Hamas is responsible for every atrocity here, both on October 7th and on all of the Gazan civilians who are suffering. And that goes for the babies too. Did anyone hear about the NICU, or like the premature baby ward, and the struggles there? That was a story that was really gaining a lot of traction in the last few weeks. Cindy, it looks like you saw some stuff about it. So the beautiful thing is, I guess the worst thing is that, again, Israel had offered to evacuate this hospital, which would have protected those babies. But initially, they did not take them up on it. And so later, as some of these babies unfortunately did pass away, and they were trying to find like emergency measures to keep them warm, they did go ahead and provide incubators into the hospital. So I had a picture of it earlier. So this was an article about what I was just talking about. Like, it's hard to provide aid even to the hospitals because a lot of that aid isn't going to the hospitals. That it's just really challenging. This was that article I referenced a minute ago about how they're saying like, oh, it wasn't a hideout for terrorists, it was a bomb shelter. And it's like, do you really keep suicide vests in bomb shelters? No, you don't. But there, you can see, this is a photo that the IDF, which is the Israeli military, they put out a photo of a military personnel delivering incubators to this hospital to help save some of the babies. So Israel has since, as I understand it, evacuated a number of those uh, vulnerable infants. And I believe they went to Egyptian hospitals to be cared for. And so that's a blessing. But just another picture of Gazan civilians really suffering. And so I think we just need to see this for the truth for what it is. Like, if point number one is Israel is doing its very best to be reasonable and negotiate to protect human life and free the hostages, Hamas is doing the opposite. They are doing everything in their power to put civilians in danger, to use them as human shields. And they are not above using hospitals and schools as their hideouts and command centers. Have any of y'all seen did y'all see the video that I sent a few weeks back of the IDF spokesman like walking through the tunnels of the pediatric hospital and like showing you where the terrorists had been?
Can you say that again, Bailey? I didn't catch that.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, no.
So the Israeli military shared a video of their spokesman taking you down into one of the terror tunnels below the pediatric hospital. And I think I had posted that a few weeks ago. So I was just wondering if any of y'all had had a chance to see that.
I haven't.
I haven't either.
Okay. No worries. No, I know we're all busy. I just thought it was really interesting because it literally, like, that news broke a day or two after our last real talk. And so it's really fascinating. You can go back in group me and check out that link. It's a powerful picture of like what is life like below the surface in Gaza. And to that end, the last point I want to make for tonight in particular is about Israel and its goals. And I want to remind us all that Israel is fighting a war to eradicate the terrorist organization of Hamas that makes its home in Gaza. They are not perpetrating genocide. And I think that is an unfortunate point to have to make. But we have to say it because that is all over social media. And it's my understanding that 70% of people our age, guys, in America are pro-Palestinian and do not support the way that Israel is waging this war. And so I have serious concerns about that number. If 70% of our peers are on basically the side of the Palestinians, I'm concerned that they're missing some key information here. And there are real allegations, that this is genocide. Oh, hey, Hana's here. Awesome. So yeah, that's my final point. And Hania, welcome. So glad you're here. We just walked through a couple of updates talking about the truce and the hostages that were released over the last week, as well as the discoveries of terrorist stations and command posts under hospitals. We talked about several stories there. But finally, yeah, I'm glad you could make it again, Hania. This is great. I hope to get to some of your questions in just a minute. But the final point being, Israel is fighting a war to eradicate Hamas terrorists who brutally attacked and killed 1,200 Israelis, mostly civilians. They are not perpetrating a genocide. And so I have a couple of pieces of evidence to help us understand this point clearly. First of all, we see that Israel is conducting a war in a way that honestly, some would argue no military has ever been more careful to avoid civilian casualties. And if we look at the numbers, it is true that there could be as many as 15,000 Gazans, mostly women and children, who have died over the past not quite 2 months. And that's awful. That's not a good thing for sure. And I would argue that Hamas is absolutely responsible for all of those deaths. But if we look at this in proportion, that would equals out to 0.7, not even 1%. We're talking 0.7% of the 2 million Gazans that live in the Gaza Strip, the 2 million Palestinians, excuse me, who live in the Gaza Strip. And so anyone who wants to point out that that is the definition of genocide is honestly completely pulling your leg and unreasonable. If Israel wanted to commit genocide, they could absolutely bomb and end the Gazan civilian population tomorrow. Like that would be the quote unquote easy way to perpetrate the conflict and make sure like no more terrorists. They absolutely have that capability. And yet we're seeing that almost 2 months into this conflict, and only 0.7% of the Gazan population has died. Again, I know that's still innocent people and it's awful, but I want us to compare this to other civilian casualty rates in recent history, because I think this is really, really helpful context. I know it was for me as I thought about like, well, every life has value. And it is awful, you know, that women and children are dying. Yes, it is. This is war. This is not pretty. This is awful. And we should not defend it. We should not make light of it. We should try to have some perspective about what's going on. So let's go back to World War II. In World War II, approximately 2 million German civilians died. 2 million. And I mentioned the Germans because, you know, they were the aggressors. You know, they could be compared to Hamas in a number of ways in this case, because they were the ones who conquered other peoples and attacked innocents. You know, I mean, the number of Polish people that they killed in that campaign. Like, I think they killed more than 30% of Polish people during World War II. 30%. You know, earlier we were talking about 0.7% of the Gazan population. No, we're talking about 30% of the Poles, and virtually all Polish Jews were killed in World War II. And you know what? I'll just share my screen. Like, these are not the most beautiful notes, but you can see, and I'm happy to share sources later if you guys want. So, yeah, that's 2 million Germans died overall. And in particular with bombing attacks, since this is kind of the style that we're talking about, like if you want to zoom in to the particular campaign and the bombing of Berlin and other major German cities at the end of the war, that's kind of similar to what Israel has been doing and causing a lot of casualties. 350,000 Germans, like civilians, this is not soldiers, 350,000 Germans were killed in the strategic bombing campaign put on by the Allied forces, mostly American and British pilots who did this. And that was a total of 0.4% of the German population. Now, don't see that number as like, well, that's half of what happened in Gaza. Like, remember, like this was a particular campaign. If you look at how many German civilians died overall during the war, it was 2.5%, which is you know, like 3 times, more than 3 times the proportional loss of life that we're seeing in Gaza. So, like, again, this is not genocide. If we want to compare further casualty rates, we can look at the fact that there were 800,000 Japanese civilians who died in World War II. That's a much smaller percentage because it's like 800,000 out of about 70 million people. And so we're talking about 1% roughly, a little bit more than 1% of Japanese civilians. So not even as drastic as the German population, but still more than the proportional population that has died in Gaza. 355,000 Vietnamese civilians died during the Vietnam War. 46,000 people died during the war in Afghanistan on terror. 200,000 civilians are estimated to have died in the Iraq War. And I thought this was a really interesting number. 1 million Afghan civilians are being deported right now from Pakistan back to Afghanistan, which is run by the Taliban. And so like no one's protesting right now about how cruel Palestine, or not Palestine, Pakistan is being to those civilians. Like they're being uprooted from their homes. They thought they had found like relative peace and freedom in Pakistan as opposed to across the mountains in Afghanistan. But 1 million Afghan civilians are being deported back into the Taliban run Afghanistan. Like that's awful. And no one is talking about it right now. It's ridiculous. Um, Furthermore, toward the point that Israel is not perpetrating a genocide, I think it's important for us to consider the number of Jews versus non-Jews that are living in Israel versus Palestine. Today, I didn't even include it here, but there are virtually no Jews who live in Palestine. It's possible that there are like 50 people, 50 Jews. There are some Christians, but again, these numbers are like negligible, like 1% or way less than the population. It's virtually 0% Jews who live in Palestine. Sorry, my capitalization is terrible here. But in Israel, Jews do make up the majority, a little over 7 million people. But the Arab community in Israel is about 21% of the population. It's estimated that there are about 2 million non-Jews who are Arabs living in peace in Israel, and they have major political parties. They have a voice. Um, they're full-fledged Israelis, and so I know Hania, like one of the questions you were referencing earlier, that's really good is like, is the term Israeli synonymous with the term Jew? And they're not necessarily. Like there are 2 million Arabs who live in Israel and are Israeli citizens with full citizenship rights. That's not the case in the rest of the Middle East. Israel stands alone as the only free democracy in the region. Like everywhere else, if you are not a Muslim, you do not have equal rights with the rest of the population. Not to mention like equal rights for women and stuff. But yeah, there's also another 500,000 people who are not even Arab or Jews. So these are like Christians and any other ethnic group. And you saw the hostages who were released. There were a significant number of Thai people. And so like it's a very international place. If you've ever been to Israel, you see that. Yeah, and so I think we already talked about this last point, that Israel really has tried to facilitate. I guess we talked about hospitals, but not in general. Because I know one of the points we were talking about last week was why did Israel, why are they bombing civilians? And yet Israel has really tried to facilitate evacuations. And in fact, like they've dropped tons of leaflets. You can see this is a link to the Jerusalem Post. And can you guys see this? It's like not sharing. Let me try again. All right, almost done here, and then we'll go to y'all's questions as well. Sorry, guys, it's like lost my site here. So this is an article talking about the Hamas terrorist group using car bombs to block evacuation routes. And you can see this is obviously a really zoomed in, grainy picture, but analysts have reported that that's what was going on here. They were blocking routes, and they were saying like, no, don't listen to the Israelis who are saying that you ought to leave. That's just propaganda. You don't want to listen to that. And I'm happy to share this article with you. But yeah, basically, the IDF published a statement and said, like, we know the Hamas terrorists are hiding in Gaza City underneath the houses, especially in this northern Gaza region. Please evacuate south for your own safety. They are using you as human shields, and we will try to not let civilians, be impacted. But look at the response that the Hamas-run government in Gaza called out. They said, like, no, don't listen to the leaflets. Don't even evacuate. That's false propaganda, psychological warfare. And we urge Palestinians to ignore that. And like he told Palestinians to remain in their homes, even if they're destroyed. And I just want to ask you guys, like, is that sane? Like, does that sound like a leader who values human life? Like, if you were a reasonable government and you were like, look, we're just trying to defend our homeland and, we're going to fight to the death. But like, we're going to send our women and children, south to safety, or we want them to get out. If the other army says, they can get out, then let's do it. No, like these people actually want to see their people murdered. And like, this is an ideology that absolutely devalues human life. And they are teaching their people that it is the most noble thing they can do to die as a martyr for the cause of, it's hard to even understand what the cause is, but the cause of eradicating Israel, the cause of defending Palestine in a sense. And that is leading to enormous loss of human life. And it's really awful. And I think it's important for us to see this for what it is. There's a term I want to share with you guys called Islamofascism. And it's, a particular brand of Islam, of how people interpret it, that looks and smells very much like Nazi Germany back in World War II. And in fact, like there's a lot of crossover into how they see human life and how they have no problem putting civilians in harm's way or seeing entire people groups, seeing it as a very like a racial and ethnic thing, as the Nazis did. And in fact, like we even have evidence very clearly that the Nazis looked up to the early, basically Islamic fascists in the Turks and the Ottoman Empire in World War One, who were the ones who perpetrated the Armenian genocide, killing over 1 million Armenians back in the late 19 teens. And so this is like, I think it was in 1917, 18. The Turks killed these Armenian Christians. There's actually a really great film about it, as well as a really awesome monument in central LA, really near where we used to meet for our LA seminars back in the day. Yeah, it's the forgotten genocide. And, Hitler looked up to the Turks who perpetrated this heinous evil and said, like, well, hey, the world didn't do anything to stop Armenia when they decided to get rid of this, people group that they hated. So let's do what we want to do with the Jews. And so it really emboldened him. And just we see again these ties between the fascistic worldview of Nazi Germany and people who want to apply their Islamic faith in this way. And last thing I'll say for jumping over to y'all's questions and thoughts is, who is Hamas? I think it's important for us to circle back on this. And did they change, right? Did they become more reasonable? Because it is true that their charter was founded back in the 80s. We read from it verbatim last Real Talk about how their founding charter was all about eradicating, like literally eliminating the state of Israel. And it is true that they revised their charter and changed some of the language in a sense back in 2017. But I think we have to see Hamas for who they are by their actions, not by their words as they edited them in 2017. I think it's kind of confusing. Like I read details about the update in 2017. It's very vague. But don't forget, guys, what happened on October 7th. What happened was terrorists, like over 1,000 terrorists entered Israel and they killed and captured almost 1,500 innocent Israelis, many of them civilians, men, women, children, soldiers. They perpetrated this attack. So anyone who says that Hamas has moderated, no, Hamas celebrated, planned, and perpetrated this attack on innocent people in Israel. And so, Jesus says, you will know them by their fruit. This is the fruit of Hamas. that we are seeing today with our own eyes. And again, they live streamed it. This is what they did, and they are proud of it. And I think I love what Dennis Prager says about the stakes of this conflict, and I'll leave it with this for now. If Hamas laid down their weapons tomorrow and called for peace, there would be no conflict. Hamas fighters might be imprisoned, put on trial, all of that, but there would be peace. There would be no more war. If Israel laid down its weapons tomorrow, there would be no more Israel. That's what Hamas wants. And 75% of civilians living in Gaza support Hamas. So it's easy for us to try to assume that both sides are like morally equivalent or just want the same thing, just want, peace and freedom. That's not true. And we can't lie to ourselves and say that. Yeah. And so thoughts, guys, what questions do you have that we didn't talk about? I'd love to hear your feedback, and definitely happy to jump into some more of your questions, Hania. I thought through a number of them very carefully earlier. So yeah, what do y'all think? What questions do you still have? Hey, Cindy.
I had a couple of questions because I feel like I was in the middle of this. I didn't really know what to think, and I'm not like on the social media, so I don't know what people are saying regarding the issues. But to me, I feel like I guess the biggest thing for me where it comes to play is how America is funding this or supporting Israel, whereas I guess that was my problem with it, where like cities in our country are like third world countries.
Sure.
And that was my issue with it, not the fact that Israel cannot defend itself from Hamas.
Yeah.
But the issue that I found with it was that why is America funding or helping to fund the war when that funding should go to American cities that need help, that are like third world countries? That's maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
It's a fair question. And I think, sorry, there was an echo for a second. Yeah, I think it's especially relevant because Congress has been debating a budget, and they're passing additional funding measures and trying to figure out, like, do we lump it all together? And there are congressmen who are saying, like, look, we need to be really thoughtful about how we're spending our money right now because our border is open. Like, we just saw terrorists breach the border in Israel, right? How many terrorists are breaching our border? And like, those are really good questions. This is not a time where we want a porous border, because we don't know who's coming in, and like, are we just like asking for trouble? Not to mention, are we not using funds to help Americans who, like you said, are living in horrible situations, in what probably seems like a third world country in places like Chicago or parts of LA? Really good question. I think this is where we have to consider timing, and we have to consider the stakes, right? We're talking about Hamas, which is a militant terrorist group, like willing to go and kill more than 1,000 civilians in one of our closest allies nations, Israel, right? And I think we have to consider their capability to hurt other civilians in other places, even to send terrorists here. I think we also need to consider who is supporting them and what is their agenda. And we know very clearly that that Iran, sorry guys, there's like a giant slug on my wall. Cool. It's literally like this long, climbing up my wall. I don't know where it came from. Okay, wow. Anyway, like, see, things can breach when you're not paying attention. So secure your homes, people. Yeah, anyway, so we have to consider, what kind of a message does this send to a place like Iran, which does have nuclear capabilities, and funds terrorist operations around the globe in other places, including Lebanon. And like they absolutely hate America. And so if we don't send a message of strength and our willingness to support our allies, particularly with like legitimate needs that they have just to have like their soldiers have boots or have enough weapons, because like, you know, this conflict started overnight, right? And so while Israel has one of the most highly trained militaries in the world, like, you know, nobody's ready for a war completely. Like you have to catch up on production for things. And so, you know, our decision to fund and support their conflict as an ally is a really important thing to do as a strategic partner, not just because their cause is just, but also because we would like to eradicate terrorists who have the capability to hurt our people as well. So it's a question of timing. We should be thoughtful. It should not be a blanket, you know, oh yes, we'll give you everything. Like, no, like but we have to be thoughtful. And of like our strategic priorities right now, like I would say, you know, I would divert some funding from Ukraine right now, for example, and divert it to Israel if we were really having to make cuts. And some people are discussing that right now. I would not divert, you know, border security funding or funding to help, you know, a lot of other places towards Israel. But yeah, that's a really great question. Does that help? Good, good, glad. What other questions y'all have? Or thoughts? I know I shared a lot. Do y'all think I got anything wrong or missed any important developments? A lot has happened. Okay, well, I want to jump in then to some of your questions, Hania, because you so thoughtfully took time to articulate your thoughts. And I marked a few that I thought were particularly great for us to discuss, but I wanted to hear from you first, Hania. Are there particular questions that are really important to you that you want to make sure we get to chat about tonight? That's okay. Can you say that one more time a little louder?
I said right now I just kind of want to listen in and see where and then like what.
Okay, yeah, no, that's fine. So if it's okay with you, I'll just pick a few of questions that you shared with me that I am happy to respond to. And if there are any that I miss and you look later and you're like, oh, I'm curious, let me know. I'd love to talk. Same for the rest of you guys. I want this to be open and feel free to interrupt, especially at this point, if there's like, wait, that doesn't make sense, or I have another question on that. So we talked a little bit about your first couple of questions, Hania, of like, why was Hamas created, and the revised charter. I think you were here for that. You were asking what was life like in Palestine before Israel's charter. That's a great question. Palestine itself actually is kind of a temporary name that the British Empire gave to Palestine because in the wake of World War I, that region, that what is today Israel, became a British colony for a few years, basically between the end of World War I and 1948. It was a British colony, and they called it British Palestine. That was the name that they gave to it. Palestinians are actually not a particular ethnic group, even though like we see this like kind of cultural pride. I'm not saying they don't have a culture. I'm just saying it's not really a distinct ethnicity from other Arab groups. They did not have a historic claim to the land. You might say that like Arabs and Muslims had lived in the region of Israel beforehand, and that is true. It was a part of the Ottoman Empire before World War I. That the Ottoman Empire was an empire, you know, a dictatorship. It was pretty brutal. They went on violent conquest. Islam was developed in the 700s, and quickly became a religion of conquest. And that's just the historic truth of it. And so, Jews and Christians, as well as a few Romans, were still living in the region of the Middle East that's now Israel. And the Arabs, militant Muslims, conquered that region from Jews and Christians who were living there. And that happened, I believe, in like the 8 and 900s, in the wake of the founding of Islam. And they basically ruled that whole region up until World War I. Under different names, and eventually, it was the Ottoman Empire through World War One. Yeah, I mean, to say that like Israel has made life hard in the region is a really narrow view, and it really misses the fact that like this region has been under brutal rule for many years. And I'm not saying that Israel is brutal today. In fact, I would argue that they actually have been very compassionate and just kind of turned, Gaza in particular over to itself to be like, hey, you don't really like us? You don't want to be under Israeli rule? Like, go figure it out. Like in 2005, they said, we're no longer going to rule. So yeah, that's just a brief history that, again, Palestine is the name given to the British colony in the brief period from World War I to 1948, when Israel achieved its independence. Is Hamas the only military that Palestine has? Palestine isn't supposed to have a military because, like, again, it's part of the state of Israel. Palestine technically, is these two regions, Gaza and the West Bank, that are these like special states that Israel has kind of said, like, fine, you don't want to be part of us. We will let you try to run yourselves. But kind of what we've seen is that project failed in the Gaza Strip in particular. And so Hamas is the most powerful military arm. There are other terrorist groups, like other wings. And in fact, there have been reports that some hostages have been like traded to other terrorist groups. And so in fact, like there have been allegations that some children who are missing were sent to another terrorist group who like paid Hamas for money so they could be involved in this campaign too, and hold hostages themselves. So it's a mess. Like there's a lot of terrorism, and there isn't a technical military. Like they had police, it's my understanding, but it's not its own country, and so it's not like there's a military arm of its own. It's one country. Let's see. You also asked, Hanya, how much did Israel's intelligence know about the October 7th attack by Hamas? Like, did they know about it before it happened? And I thought it was really interesting that you brought this up because I've seen this on social media and stuff. Obviously, this is a debatable point. Like, I haven't sat down with Israeli intelligence, but from everything that I have heard reported, in fact, it was a great intelligence failure by the Israeli military, which is kind of shocking because they have some of the best intelligence personnel in the entire world. And they did not foresee this attack. And in fact, there's a strategic bombing campaign that it started with at like 6:30 in the morning on October 7th. And again, this is like their Sunday, right? Pearl Harbor was on a Sunday, a surprise attack. This was on a Sunday, effectively, the Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath. And so like no one was, expecting that. It was a big Jewish holiday. It was like Christmas Day. They like jammed the computers or something. And so they were like, they didn't even set off alarms at first when they breached the big wall between Gaza and the Israel right next to it, which is really fascinating how they did it. And then they blew up a bunch of parts of the wall as well. So it's really seen as this great failure of intelligence. And for anyone to say that like, oh, Israel knew and they let it happen, like what? Like why? Why would they allow that to happen? And I don't see any evidence of that. So like I think if they had known about it, like in a sense they might have wanted to share. But at this point, even if they admitted failures in other ways, but like at the moment, they are like tucking their tail, the Israeli intelligence community, and saying like, we royally messed this up, and we had no idea. Yeah, no, that's a good question, Cindy. I think we'll continue to learn more, but their details we'll probably never know, because those will be like secret things that you have to have classified clearance to get. Yeah, and if other questions come up while we're talking through this, let me know. My plan is to just run through another 10 or 15 minutes of your questions, and we're just working through a really neat list that Hanya, you put together. And so thanks again, Hanya, for prompting good discussion. Let's see. So you asked about what has Israel's success rate been in the war on Hamas? This is really hard to get good numbers on because, one, it's hard to get good numbers when you're in the midst of fighting a war. But secondly, again, we're fighting terrorists who embed themselves in the civilian population. And so it's really hard to know like who you're actually killing. Like, are they a terrorist? Are they affiliated with terrorists? Or are they innocent? It's really hard to determine. So we're going to have to wait some time. But Israel and their military claim that they've had great success. In fact, there are credible reports that they have taken out one of the masterminds of the October 7th attack, and that they've made great progress, particularly in northern Gaza, where there are a lot of outposts. And now they've taken over the hospitals, right? The main pediatric and the big central hospital. And so I think that's honestly like really, really good news, because you see not only are they getting to the meat of like where are these terrorist hideouts and where are their command posts, but they are also helping civilians, like rescuing them from being under the control of Hamas at the same time. The bummer is Hamas has just had a whole week to regroup, right? So that's the bummer of the truce, is like, yes, I'm thankful that there was a pause in the fighting and that hostages were released. Those were both good things, but this has now given Hamas a chance to just regroup and get stronger. And so I worry for the amount of human life that will put in jeopardy later on. You asked about why people are protesting in Israel against Netanyahu, who's the prime minister. I actually didn't have a chance to look into this one, and I don't know. So feel free if any of y'all see that. Israel is a place that is parliamentary in their government. So they have a ton of different like small political parties that just try to like work together to have power. And so like Netanyahu has had mixed reviews. He's been in power a long time. Not everyone agrees with him. So it's not really surprising that there's protests. Like that kind of thing is really common. And in a democracy, like I think there could be good to it. So feel free to send me more. I don't really know much about that one. Let's see. You asked a lot about displaced Palestinians. I don't have a firm number. I know it's a huge number of people. Like there are 2 million Palestinians overall in Gaza. Not all of them are displaced, but in a sense, all of them are living in a war zone right now, particularly the ones who live in the densely populated northern half. That's really just like an unfortunate factor of them being in a war zone right now. It's really unfortunate. I think what we need to see is that Israel is not trying to drive these people out permanently. They are trying to find terrorists and kill them and make sure that they can never hurt innocent civilians again, bringing them to justice. Like that's what their goal is. Honestly, like I think that like the higher the number of displaced Palestinians, probably the better, like for their own safety. Because anyone who's staying in Gaza right now, like what kind of a person stays in the midst of a war zone where terrorists are hiding out? Like if you found out that there were terrorists hiding out in your neighborhood who were trying to wage war on the United States and kill innocent people, like would you stay, or would you be like, I'm gonna go take a trip right now, even if I have to leave, all of my stuff? That's what you're gonna do. Like that's the logical response. It's difficult, and many of them are living in refugee camps. There are camps in the south, and it's my understanding that Egypt has, on a limited basis, opened up its border. But like these people are the people who are honestly like trying to take care of themselves. And so I think there's actually a lot of good to those Palestinians who are no longer like in Gaza right now or who are displaced from their homes. At least they're like fleeing from a war zone. I'm deeply concerned about the kinds of people who would stay and not evacuate. Maybe that shows that they, have health issues or are old or something, but like Israel has offered to help with evacuations. And so people who are not taking you up on it, like it's fair to ask the question, like, who do you support? Are you trying to help terrorists? Why would you not evacuate? And so let's see. Pause here, water break. Anybody have any questions based on that before we get to the last few? Just gonna grab my cord. Okay. So, Hania, you also asked about how many Palestinians are being held in prison without charge in Israel, and how long have they been held? I don't know that. I didn't have as much time to look into this number. I also don't know that this number would be widely reported or even released by Israel. Like honestly, like this seems like a number that would be hard to get an accurate read on. Like there may be an allegation that Hamas or the Palestinian government says like, oh, they're holding, this many of our people. And Israel, probably refutes that and says like, no, we're not holding that many people. But it's hard to know that. What I would offer is it is very possible, that there are Palestinians being held in Israel without charge. I mean, Haidar shared that I believe it's his uncle and another family member were held in Israel in prison for 2 weeks, I believe, a few years ago during some of the conflict with Lebanon. And that's awful. And I hate that they were wrapped up in that. But this is the challenge, guys, of being able to figure out who are the actual terrorists and how do you figure out, who is siding with who or helping whom, when these terrorists don't wear uniforms, they don't identify themselves, and they're willing, for example, to put suicide vests on children and women, and they're willing to use them in their operations. Hania, you asked, like, shouldn't they release that information? Maybe for the sake of transparency, but Hania, consider the military objective here. Like if you think that you have, a spy, or if you think that you have a terrorist in your possession and you're trying to gather evidence in order to, pursue justice for that person, there might be situations where you wouldn't release their identity. You might not, there might be people that have been caught up that you don't actually want the terrorists to know that you have. So I think we just have to think a little bigger. I realize that, for journalistic transparency, like, especially from our American perspective, that like no one is guilty, or you're innocent until you're proven guilty. But I think we have to consider like the big challenge of fighting a terrorist group here. I think it's reasonable for them to be challenged as they work through the justice process. Like, if we remember correctly, in the last hostage release that happened a few years ago, they actually released hostage release. Like, there were a few soldiers that were being held hostage in Gaza. I forget the year. I could get you the article on this, but they ended up releasing like 800 Palestinians who had been held in prison. And one of those who was released was the mastermind of the October 7th attack. And so, like, consider this, that like every person that Israel releases, like they have to be very sure that they're not going to go back and perpetrate further attacks. And so, yeah, I would just say that I think there are military reasons when you're fighting terrorists that you might not publish all of that information. But I think, they're not trying to have concentration camps. There aren't that many people that we're talking about. But But yeah, we can talk more about that later. Let's see. You asked about what happens to Palestinian culture, their life, their like what it's like for these people as they're, potentially displaced and living outside of Gaza. Like it is difficult, but like at least they will be alive. And I think we have to see that this is just what life is like in the modern world. But not to mention that, like we also see that the people of God in the Bible are great examples of what it's like to live in exile and to be faithful to your tradition and your culture. I mean, that's what most of the Old Testament is about, is life in exile for the people of God. And they had to fight for sure to grow healthy families and to protect their faith. But that's not the worst thing ever. And in fact, much of today, like there's opportunities for them to live in peace and freedom, even as Arabs. Although it is odd to me because there are a lot of Arab countries who actually don't want to accept the Palestinians and allow them to live in like their country. So that says something like, why did Egypt not want to open its borders initially to let Gazans in? Like, oh, maybe it's because they're worried that there are terrorists embedded with them. Yeah, so let's see. We already talked about your question of are Israeli and Jew interchangeable terms. I would argue they're not. Jew is a religious term. Israeli is a political. It's a nationality term. There are.
Disconnected.
You guys hear me?
Yeah. Go ahead.
I can't hear you guys. I just wanted to ask another question based on that last question. What happens to like
Sure.
displaced Palestinians from like all over the world from the past like 75 years? Like another thing that I was picking up on, like on PragerU and the comments and all of that, they were saying, okay, well, what happens when like Palestinians don't want to leave their home, but they're forced to leave? That's just creating more people that resent Israel.
Mhm. Yeah, but I mean, do you allow terrorists to get away with murder for the sake of not like sympathizing? Like, think of that logic if we apply it to World War II. Like, if we had said, like, oh, we don't want to kill too many Germans and Nazis, or bomb, Berlin because that might create more Germans who hate America or who want to start another war. Like, wars would never end in that case, or you would always let the bad guys win. And so, like, I think the second part of my answer would be I don't believe that Israel is trying to permanently displace Palestinians and from their homes in Gaza. Like, they're trying to execute a military campaign against Hamas, and they're not trying to destroy all of the infrastructure. Like, if you see pictures, I saw a picture from December 3rd, which was yesterday, of a bombing that happened. Like, the city is there. Like there's obviously been great destruction. But like the Gaza Strip is still filled with homes and buildings and businesses. And like Israel is not trying to fully flatten Gaza and make sure that people can never return. I mean, this is where my point earlier about like how many non-Jews are Israeli citizens is really thoughtful. Like 25% of the people in Israel who are Israeli citizens, they they are non-Jews. And so like this is not an ethnic thing. This is really a religious conflict here of people who are religious, have religious tolerance, and then the other side that does not. So I don't think we should be worried about the displaced persons like never having a home to come back to. Does that answer your question, Hania? And then Cindy, I saw you had your hand up.
Kind of, but not really, because that's what we saw, like based on like the past 75 years, right? Like now everybody, all Palestinians that came to Jordan, to the United States, those are the people that are rallying up here and like kind of speaking about their family stories and letting other people know. Because I remember prior to the attack on October 7th and prior to when Israel declared war on Hamas, I was reading about all these stories before then. like that wasn't the beginning. Like Palestinian people have come to the United States and tried to like express that like they want to go back. They would
Mhm.
like to go back to what their family once had over there.
Sure.
So
And,
like
and a lot of people do move to Israel. I don't know all of the specifics about why people are not going back, and I'd be happy to explore that topic more another time. I think it's important for us to see like the mess that particularly the Gaza Strip is in, the mess that Hamas and other terrorist groups have created, in that it's not a safe, peaceful place to live. Like they're the ones who have destroyed it and who have expropriated tons of aid and made it so that it's one of the poorest and most densely populated places. And so people who want to live in peace and freedom and who want to live in the multicultural place of Israel, like people move there all the time. And so I think we need to think widely of like maybe your family does have history there, and at the same time, like the seeds have been sown, and the people of Gaza, potentially the relatives of these people voted in Hamas to be their leadership in early 2000s, and this is what's happened as a result of this leadership.
well, yeah, but even before Hamas was created, they were like there, but like when it wasn't just Gaza, like when there was other regions there that belonged to Palestine, like those people would still like have some history there.
Sure.
So power off. Sorry.
And so, like, I don't know if you're talking about some of the like settlements of Jews that have kind of moved into the West Bank, or if you're talking about like how Israel has had land disputes with like Palestinian people, and there have been allegations that they've kicked Palestinians out of their land in new ways. But reports that I have read are that like there's a lot of actual Palestinian squatters. Like these are people who are still there, those kind of land disputes. I'm not talking about people who are in America, but there are like Palestinians who haven't paid rent in, over a decade. And they're like just still living there, making claim that like, well, this is our land, so we shouldn't have to pay rent. And it's like their actual documentation of like the land being sold and not being in their possession anymore. And yet they're refusing to give up occupancy. And so there have been, Palestinians evicted in different places in Israel as a result. But in terms
So
of
if they
like,
were
go ahead.
sorry, so if they like, well, I've like I haven't seen much of that. Like the only real things I know are like the actual people that are living in the United States
Okay.
who like are Palestinian and have expressed that like even when they were in the Middle East,
Mhm.
they like had to leave Palestine and to go to like Jordan was like the prominent place that like most Palestinians went to, some in Puerto Rico or
Mhm.
like all around, So
Mhm.
it's
Why did
just
they have to
like
leave?
I'd have to ask them, but that's what I'm saying. Like they
Yeah,
were
I think
displaced somehow, and they have like resentment towards Israel. So like I'm trying to connect the dots here, see
sure.
what miles or like what area there is like what happened. So like if Israel took over and like they now have the rights to land,
Mhm.
the people that like still had in their minds that it's still Palestine, they
Mhm.
wouldn't want to pay Israel because then that's
Well,
like
these are like
admitting.
private. Sure, but like the story I was referencing, like these are private individuals. This isn't like the government like coming in and saying like this is all ours now. Like we're taking over this whole neighborhood. No, this is like private contracts that were being breached by private citizens. And so yeah, I'm happy to find that story if you want it. But in terms of those living here who are displaced, I think it's worth asking more questions. And I'd be happy to do some more research on that myself. It's not an aspect that I've really looked at, but I do understand that there are a lot of people who, yeah, are protesting on the side of Palestine here in America because they have those kind of ties. And I think my fear is that they're not getting all the information and that they're just seeing this from a really emotional perspective, and that maybe we're not, giving enough responsibility to Hamas for this whole mess, among other terrorist groups. Because like Palestine, even before Hamas's charter in the 80s, does not have a record of good governance internally, very corrupt. But yeah, let me pause there, Hania, because Cindy, you've had your hand up for a while, so feel free to jump in.
So I had a question more towards, I guess, my questions are more towards like cultural wise. So I can see how like a lot of people can side against Israel because of like the rhetoric around like politicians, like the other question that I had. And I guess another question that I just thought of is why is the, like, I would say like Israel and the Jewish religion, how come it seems like it's more like of a protective class, where as opposed to like Christians, uh you can openly talk negative about Christians and almost persecute them to the point of like losing your job and everything like that, like taking a stand for your religion, whereas opposed to like a Jewish, someone who comes from Jewish background or Jewish religion, there's laws against that.
Yeah, that's a good question, because you're talking about like within Israel in particular, why is there this disparity? I
Yeah.
don't know a ton about this legal tradition, but I think this is where it's important for us to step back and consider like part of why the nation of Israel was created in the first place. And it was because we had just walked through a global Holocaust where, 6 million Jews were exterminated. And, we know how it started. We've been to the Holocaust Museum, right, guys? It started by othering people and like creating categories and saying that like people of this religion, we're not going to patriate their businesses. We're going to put gold stars on them. We're not going to allow them to attend our schools. They're not going to be allowed to work in this factory. They're going to lose their job. And so I think like those laws are very likely reactionary to those kinds of Nazi German policies, to specifically discriminate against Jews. And Israel, is the only country in the world that's specifically like created as a Jewish state, designed as a response to that horrible atrocity of the Holocaust. And so I think it's reasonable in that sense. In terms of like, what about the Christians and like, are they persecuted? I don't know of any persecution of Christians that like actively happens legally in Israel. To your point, it's possible that they have more of a free market approach of saying that like, oh, if you want to, only hire Jews to work in your store, like you can have that preference as a private business owner. Like you don't have to hire a Christian, and treat them in that sense like equally. Like you can prefer to hire, someone of your same faith, a Jew, and not a Christian. That would be my best guess. I would be happy to look into that more. I just don't have specifics. But oh, you're saying in America. Um, why do we protect Jews more as opposed to Christians? I don't know that we do. At least I think we've seen, anti-Semitic attacks in America have risen over 400% in the wake of the October 7th attack. And so yeah, but I think in a sense like we could see the Jewish people in America as a protected class because they're a religious people, they are an ethnic group, and they are also a group again with that history of discrimination and a history of genocide. So I think it's this sense that we believe in religious liberty, and yet like we want to acknowledge and never let the Holocaust happen again. So that would be my best guess. I don't know that it's like, maybe it's a short-sighted distinction, and maybe it does mean that Christians are dealing with some like economic persecution here in particular. and not as many protections. But I think honestly, we should just pursue a very free market approach to, hiring policies and those kinds of things. But yeah, it is interesting. Like, I think we're going to see a season in the United States where we're going to have to think very carefully of like, there are going to be more and more hate crimes against Christians, most likely based on the trends. And we're not be ready for that, like personally with courage, and politically to say that like, hey, let's stand up for Christians here. Because, Barack Obama is infamous for targeting conservative nonprofits, like organizations a lot like Windrose, because he didn't like them or because they, leaned pro-right or into the Christian faith. And he audited and made it very difficult for tons of nonprofits. Like this was a season right before Windrose was founded. And then praise the Lord, like there was a regime change and, a president who said, no, like we should allow nonprofits to do what they do and we should not be persecuting them. But yeah, I'll leave that there for now. That's a good question, Cindy. Frustrating, but good question. All right. Well, I know it is getting late. It's 11 here, and we've been at this just about 90 minutes, guys. Thanks for sticking with it. Hania, I wanted to address one more of your questions about how much weight to give, particularly to Gazan social media influencers and other reporters, as you call them. But are there any other questions, Hania, that you wanted to touch base on tonight, other than that one?
I really do have to get home too, so like I want to respect everyone's time, but we could just finish off on that and then
Okay,
we'll go from
cool.
there, I guess.
We've had a lot of good meat. Yeah, so this is an important point, and this kind of lands on, I have two challenges to leave y'all with. But starting with your question, Hania, how heavily should we take into consideration words directly transmitted from people on the ground in Gaza? And you mentioned several names, including Bissam, Bissam, and I have looked at some of their reporting. But yeah, how heavily should we take them into consideration? Okay, I think you can absolutely look at their reporting. I think you can see, their eyewitness accounts of certain things. But what we have to do is take a step back and consider, are they credible? And how much information do they really have? And are they objectively reporting? Or are they stating some facts and then creating a narrative and assuming a lot and missing a lot of information? That's been my concern as I've looked into some of the reporters, like designated press that have arisen in the last couple of months. Because, like one of the ones I was looking at, she was just like a travel social media influencer before the conflict. And then like as of October 7th, she became this like militant pro Gaza, even pro Hamas reporter of saying like Israel is, committing genocide and killing innocents intentionally. Like, hold on, like how much do you know on the ground? And I think that's where, if you're listening to this right now, I want you to take your finger and I want you to hold it a total of like 2 inches from your nose. Can you see your finger clearly? Where is your finger? You can't see it because you are too close. If you move your finger back about 5-6 inches away, you can see your finger. But when you are too close to a situation, you can't see it clearly. And so that's my biggest concern. Like, I don't think they're wrong for posting footage of bombings or of things that are happening around them. I don't think they're wrong for having a voice. I don't want to silence them, but I do want us to be really prudent about what sources we give credence to, and how much we trust the narrative that they're writing. Like, are they objective reporters? Maybe. I honestly don't know that I've seen one. And if you have one, Hania, or if you guys have seen one, let me know. But we need to be really careful. Like, these are not typically people who have built, a long career of objective journalism in a reputable source in a public way. Like, they're some of them are young people like you and I with their phone, with very little perspective. They have a particular angle, and again, I don't think we should necessarily silence them, but I think we should be very careful when they start going from just objective reporting of like, this is what I see or this is what I saw happen, to like, this is the full story, this is the narrative, this is exactly who did this. Like, they don't know who fired the bomb, right? It could have been a terrorist group or it could have been Israel. Like, how are they going to know that standing on the street watching the effects of a tragedy? So we need to be really prudent about how much weight we give them. And in fact, this is where I'll leave y'all with two challenges. I would encourage y'all, especially where this conflict is concerned, to just take a break, detox from social media in general. You might embrace Advent. I'm trying to do this in this season before Christmas and just not spend time on social media, for these next 3 weeks until Christmas. Not get my news from social media, not just allow my eyes to, consume videos without context. And so I would encourage all of you guys to give that a try as well. I think it's really healthy. I think it allows us to metaphorically step back and get some perspective. Read widely, read different news sources. Consider, the different sides and really look carefully for like, what are the facts here? What do we know? And who can we trust? And be very careful before we trust terrorists. Yeah. And finally, I would challenge you as you replace your social media consumption and you're looking to challenge your thinking. I think a really good case study of a conflict that was much larger than this one, but has a lot of good things to apply here in terms of the values and how you perpetrate a conflict, the difficulty of war. Go listen to the Hillsdale free online course on the Second World Wars. It features historian Victor Davis Hanson. He's actually from the Fresno area. He's super awesome. He's taught at Fresno State for years and is an expert in military history, among other things. He's a great speaker. He's worked at Stanford for many years in California. Fascinating guy. And I just listened to this series over the last 2 weeks, like while I was doing dishes in the evening. And it's so good, guys. It's like not quite an hour per episode, and there's 7 episodes. It really wouldn't take you that long. I'm sure you drive or fold laundry or do dishes or do something where you could listen to it in the next couple of weeks. But it's really good perspective of like, how do you answer tough questions and how do you perpetrate a war to bring to justice, the Axis powers and their evil ideology that killed millions of innocent people. I mean, the numbers are staggering when I listen to this, that in Russia, 27 million innocent people were killed. And in China, the Japanese killed 15 million innocent people, along with 5 million others across Southeast Asia. This was an axis of evil, as Reagan referred to it. And this was an ideology, Japanese militarism and Nazi Germany. They were ideologies that devalued human life at all costs. And I think it's a really great comparison and helped give me some perspective on this conflict. So go listen to the Hillsdale free online course on the Second World Wars. I'll send a link on GroupMe. And yeah, thank you guys so much for taking time tonight. Thank you, Hana, again, for such thoughtful questions to help us finish off. I really appreciate you guys being thoughtful and engaging. We have to, like, this is an issue that's really dividing not only our country, but particularly our generation. And so we have to be thoughtful and prudent and willing to talk about this difficult topic. So I love you guys. And with that, we'll conclude.